Well, thank you. I appreciate the invite to come and share some of this research. Basically, what I've been asked to do is give an overview of the PM-related mortality studies in 15 minutes. So that's all right. Now, can I right-click? Left-click. The reality is it's impossible to do. Mary has already discussed this a bit. She showed a little different figure, but the reality is that we now know from a huge amount of research, most of which has been reviewed by the EPA, but others, myself and others, we know that inhaling fine particulate pollution into the lungs results in all sorts of impacts on the lungs, outlined by many, many studies. We also are now beginning to learn that there's a systemic effect. The whole body is affected really by what originates sometimes in the lungs, but certainly as a result of this inhalation of particle pollution. And as a result, we have numerous studies that have looked at the effects of exposure to air pollution on the blood, on the vasculature, on the heart, and even on the brain. Now, naturally, we cannot speak about all of this today, but it's already been mentioned. For example, there have been a huge number of daily time series studies. Dan mentioned this. I won't go through these studies except for to say that here's another forest plot that Dan has already described what we mean. You can see essentially the percent increased risk in mortality associated with exposure to, or short-term exposure to particulate pollution is fairly consistent across either meta-analyses of many, many studies or these multi-city studies that have been conducted. And now the daily time series studies really include studies of over 200 cities, and many of these cities have been studied multiple times. The results are that we have small but remarkably consistent associations across the meta-analyses. But anyway, this is just a point I'm trying to make a point that the overall literature now is far too massive to review in any short presentation. So the objective of this presentation is to focus on the most relevant studies to estimate overall mortality effects. And these are the cohort studies of long-term exposure that have already been mentioned. Now, it's hard to review these studies, even this narrow focused set of studies, these prospective cohort studies, in any one slide. But here you can see again, as a forest plot, you have the point estimates of various different studies. You have the 95% confidence intervals. What we have here is the percent increase in mortality per 10 micrograms per cubic meter of PM2.5 across a whole host of studies. And I've got the results broken out into all-cause mortality, cardiopulmonary mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and ischemic heart disease mortality. Now, some of these studies are going to be covered in more detail throughout the day, but I just want to sort of give a brief overview of what's going on. So, for example, let's start with would you back up, please? Let's start with just looking at the Harvard six-city study briefly. It's these sort of in the maroon color, and we get estimates here, for all-cause cardiopulmonary and cardiovascular disease mortality. The Harvard six-city study was published originally in 1993 in the New England Journal of Medicine. Basically, it was at the time, it was a 14 to 16-year prospective follow-up of just over 8,000 adults living in 6 U.S. cities. There was monitoring of various pollutants, including PM2.5. The data were analyzed using the most sort of relevant and sophisticated statistical models available at the time. These have been improved over the years, but have not changed the results much. We can control for individual differences in age, sex, smoking, body mass index, education, occupational exposure, etc. The bottom line is the 6 cities included 2 relatively clean cities, 2 relatively dirty cities, 2 cities sort of in the middle. And over the years, as you followed up the cohort, we saw that individuals living in the more polluted cities tended to die more rapidly than those in the cleaner cities. And even after controlling for age, sex, race, cigarette smoking, and various other factors, we continue to see an increased adjusted relative risk associated with for mortality associated with air pollution. Now, of course, the biggest risk factor in this was cigarette smoking, substantially bigger than for air pollution. But in the 6-city study, we observed that there was an increase, statistically significant increase in the risk of mortality associated with fine particulate air pollution as well as sulfates. And as Mary already mentioned, these results tended to suggest a near linear exposure-response relationship. Now, there was a lot of controversy with regards to this study and its sort of sister study, the ACS study, that we'll talk about in just a minute. As Dan has already mentioned, the Health Effects Institute oversaw a very large reanalyses of the Harvard Six-City study and the ACS study. Dan Krusky, who's here, Rick Burnett, Mark Goldberg, and 28 others over a period of about 3 years reanalyzed these data, and as Dan mentioned, got essentially the same results. There have been now 2 publications doing extended analyses of the Harvard Six-City study. So now if you look at that forest plot I showed just at the beginning, you can see the Harvard Six-City study gets these results, basically about a 15% increase in all-cause mortality associated with 10 micrograms per cubic meter, and bigger increases if you focus in on cardiopulmonary or cardiovascular disease. This was a well-designed study that's undergone extensive peer review and reanalysis, and the results are robust and reproducible. Motivated by the Harvard Six-City study, we conducted some analyses using data from the American Cancer Society Cancer Prevention 2 cohort. This was data using air pollution data for up to 151 cities, and risk factor data for over 500,000 adults enrolled in this cohort. Again, the results were similar to what we saw in the Harvard Six-City study. The biggest risk factor was cigarette smoking, but there was a significant effect of both fine particles and/or sulfur oxide pollution. This study, along with the Harvard Six-City study, was reanalyzed as part of the HEI reanalysis project. We did an extended analysis published in 2002 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Again, a number of the people, George is here, Dan is here, I'm here, a number of us that were involved in this study. Bottom line is again, we observed this near linear exposure-response relationship between exposure to fine particles and all-cause mortality, but the biggest effect still was with cardiopulmonary mortality. Another reanalysis focusing on the general pathophysiologic pathways of the disease, or at least trying to get a feel of what's going on. Again, we observed that most of the results were actually being driven by ischemic heart disease and related cardiovascular disease. This study, I'm sure that Dr. Jarrett is here. He was very involved in this reanalyses at the LA area. Interesting for those of you in California. Again, we used the ACS data to look more specifically at metro area differences in exposure in LA. And